Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nino Scalia, and it's my pleasure to be co-hosting this Twitter space alongside my very good friend Micah Meadowcroft. This is the second in a series of conversations we're doing with men and women engaged in the fight to defend the West and revitalize the American way of life. Today, we're joined by truly an all-star lineup featuring Johnny Burtka, president of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, Dr. Kevin Roberts, president of the Heritage Foundation, and Senator J.D. Vance of Ohio. The proximate cause of our conversation today is the release of Johnny's stellar new book, Gateway to Statesmanship, Selections from Xenophon to Churchill. And I'll just upfront acknowledge that you'll hear probably multiple different pronunciations of that name, Xenophon. But we'll be using that book as a launch pad into our discussion of statesmanship in the modern age. One last thing before we get started in earnest. First, for our panelists, Micah and I will direct our questions to you individually just to make things a little bit cleaner, but you'll all obviously have important and interesting things to say on each topic, so please don't hesitate to jump in at any point. Micah and I will not be offended if you interrupt us. And then second, for those of you in the audience, we're going to keep this to an hour, but we may have some time at the end for questions from you all. So if you have a question, send it by way of direct message here on Twitter to Micah or to me. And if we have time and if your question is any good, we'll invite you to speak. Okay, that's a lot of words from me. So Micah, I'll turn things over to you to introduce yourself and lead us off.
Thank you, Nino. It's great to be here. As you said, I am Micah Meadowcroft. I'm the research director at the Center for Renewing America. I'm a writer and the co-host of this ongoing, what we hope to be and plan to be this ongoing series of spaces. Very happy to have you all. So Johnny, let's begin with the architectonic question here. What is statesmanship and how do you think about it in your own work? This applies to Senator Vance and Dr. Roberts as well. We'd love to hear your answers. But Johnny, could you define our terms for us and also explain how it is you came to put together this reader and to write this introduction? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nino, Micah, and JD and Kevin for joining. So statesmanship is really the art of governing or the art of ruling in a political regime. And for the purpose of this book, I assessed the state of our current regime and felt, in particular, in Washington, D.C., that we are no longer being governed by a group of excellent or virtuous or wise leaders, that it's a republic has corroded really into, I think, an oligarchy, it could be argued. And so this exercise was, how do we get out of our present crisis? How do we reimagine what is required for political leadership today? So I went back, thousands of years, going all the way to the ancient world in East and West, and I compiled a number of classic texts on statesmanship from the Mirrors for Princes tradition, which really sought to offer practical, both political and moral advice for political leaders. And so I've gone all the way back to ancient Greece, Rome, China, India, all the way through the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, and have put together this classic collection of texts. And the one thing I'll add before handing it back over is that these were very popular books that were so popular, they were some of the most popular things written or studied for thousands of years. It said that Julius Caesar never left a battle without carrying copies of Xenophon's The Education with him, out to the battlefield, and also that that Thomas More never left the house without a copy of Cicero's On Duties in his breast pocket. So these aren't just pie in the sky works of theory about statesmanship. They really offer practical advice for a political leader, and they're meant to be easily digestible and actionable items for statesmen today.
Senator Vance or Dr. Roberts, could you say how you think about statesmanship? I mean, it's a highfalutin word in a democratic age, and what do you consider the virtues of statesmanship as applies to the work that you do?
Well, I'll jump in. This is Kevin. Thanks for having me. I think about this not just as a policy leader, and on that point, the dearth of statesmen I think is pretty obvious, but also as a historian of America, and it's one of the reasons I think Johnny's book is so good. I say that not just because he's a friend; it really is that good. In other words, I think about every era in American history since our founding, and I'm hard pressed, other than this era, to come up with an era, say 25, 40-year span, when there was such a lack of statesmen as there are today. And by that, I should say too, there were statesmen on the left and there were statesmen on the right. I think about one of my favorite statesmen in history, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. I think those of us today in the 21st century on the right can learn a lot from Moynihan. So what Johnny's book does, in being timeless, if you think about the selections of it, but it's also timely, is give us sort of an intellectual, historical grounding in what's at stake in this particular era, say this particular year, this election year, if in fact we don't place a higher priority as we're going to the polls and selecting our men and women who lead us. Of course, a statesman need not necessarily be an elected official, but obviously a preponderance of them are. So I guess it's I should say that it's fitting. I don't mean this in any patronizing way. I often argue that one of the statesmen of our age, even though he's been in the Senate for a short while, is Senator Vance. So I think it's totally appropriate that he be part of this panel.
Well, thanks, Kevin, and that was some introduction. Good to see everybody. I'll echo Kevin's endorsement of Johnny's book, which I do think is quite good here. And I guess I'll say just a couple things about statesmanship and how I think about it, just in my own work and how I try to proceed through the Senate. The first is we live in an era where people in elected office and positions of leadership tend not to think about managing the passions, the prejudices, the the interests, but just sort of what do their people actually want to do, right? Like human beings are complicated, sort of all of us are flawed and good in various ways, and I think if you're like trying to manage a political situation in a country as big and complicated as ours, then you have to actually think about what it is that your people want and what they're willing to do and what they're willing to tolerate. And that's like an important part of forming any particular public policy is not just what do I, as a senator or a governor or somebody else, think is in the good, what do I think is in the best interest of people, but like what are people actually willing to ride along with and what are they willing to tolerate? And there's just precious little of that among our leadership today. There's just sort of like extraordinarily condescending, high self-regard that senators and other public officials have for themselves, where they say, well, I think this is in the good of the country, or I think this is morally good or upstanding, and therefore we're going to go and do it, regardless of whether we think the people are actually willing to follow us. And that I think is like a really arrogant way to think about your position as a leader. And there's no area where I think of this issue as more pressing than this question of what do we do with our our commitments and our responsibilities in Ukraine. And like whatever your particular views are on that particular conflict, I'm happy to get into them, but I won't for the purposes of this particular conversation. But what I will say is there's an astounding lack of consideration for what are we asking the American people to do? What are we requesting of them? What are their biases going into this thing? Are we articulating a vision for what we want them to accomplish? You go back to the era of World War II and you listen to a speech by Franklin Roosevelt, or you sort of listen to these sort of fireside chats that he did on the radio from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It is astonishing to compare the specific ways in which Roosevelt is articulating a plan of action. Here's what we're doing. Here's how long it's going to take to do it. Here's how much money and resources we're going to take in order to accomplish this goal. And compare this with the incredibly generic, general moralizing of Joe Biden when it comes to our responsibilities in Ukraine. If you're an American listening to the president talk about Ukraine, you'd be forgiven for having no idea what it is that we're actually trying to accomplish or how long we're expected to accomplish it. And I think that's an incredibly insulting way to try to run foreign policy in an alleged democracy, a complete lack of consideration or care for your own citizens, just not a way to sort of run a foreign policy at all. And the second thing that I'll say that's just very weird to me about American statesmanship in the 21st century is if you go back to Teddy Roosevelt, the famous formulation of speaking softly and carrying a big stick, American statesmanship these days appears to be to speak as loudly as possible while carrying as small a stick as possible. And it's kind of astonishing to me how much, and of course I'm going to get a little partisan here, but it's astonishing how much the modern American elites sort of criticize Donald Trump for they'll say that he's careless, or they'll say that he's reckless. And yet, when it comes to matters of statesmanship, he's the most careful president and leader that we've had, at least in a generation, because he actually acknowledges that other countries, they might be bad guys. Might not be led by totally moral or perfect people, but they have distinctive interests. And if you want to get anything done, you actually have to deal with them as human beings who lead countries with interests. You can't just sort of wag your finger at them and say, well, we're good, you're bad, so you're going to do whatever I want you to do. The idea that Donald Trump is allegedly the reckless one because he refuses to engage in that ridiculous generic moralizing, it's like one of the most insulting things to the American people's intelligence that I've ever seen. And yet it has become incredibly common among this generation of American statesmen. They've been trained in the art of thinking that they're good and everyone else is bad. They've not been trained in the art of actually considering America's interests as part of a complicated milieu of foreign policy and foreign interests. And if you want to pursue America's interests, you kind of have to pick and choose and prioritize. And that's just something that American leadership seems totally unwilling to do in 2024.
Theme that's already very apparent here, and I know, Johnny, it kind of prompted you writing this book, is the total lack of statesmanship as kind of the height of political excellence, totally absent from American political life today. Dr. Roberts, you're a student of American history. I'm curious, when you think about the great statesmen of American history, are there virtues or qualities of American statesmanship that strike you as distinctly American or uniquely important in America?
Yeah, great question. I mean, you immediately think about the seemingly generic sounding but still important virtue of selfless sacrifice, of putting the good of the whole, in this case, the good of the republic, ahead of self-interest. There are other countries, however, where that's fairly profound. I mean, I think about where I'm going pretty soon in a little while, the United Kingdom. Definitely the case there. But I do think there's something that, if it's not uniquely American, is distinctly American, at least in the modern and early modern age, and that is this Aristotelian idea of magnanimity. That is the, almost direct translation, the striving of the soul, the striving of the spirit to great things. And if you think about what was happening in Philadelphia in 1776 and once again in 1787, where we I would argue practically perfected ordered liberty, the balancing of order and liberty, was that it wasn't just for sort of the practical considerations of individual Americans to have ordered liberty and ultimately to flourish as human persons. It was that the very project, the very notion of waking up in America, regardless of where your people were from, regardless of how rich or poor they were, was that you were going to be part of a project, a republic that is striving every day for great things, ultimately the flourishing of its people. But very much in line with what JD said, that the republic itself, its policymakers at the federal level, the state level, are making virtuous decisions. And in fact, there's a great book. I mean, a lot of books that talk about magnanimity. There's a terrific one by Alexander Havard called Virtuous Leadership that really talks about the importance of this. And I would say, just to kind of come full circle on Senator Vance's comment on Ukraine and conservative national security, one of the reasons we're getting this wrong, regardless of what someone thinks about what ought to happen in terms of American military aid to Ukraine, is the absence of magnanimity generally among most of our policymakers. But also, secondly, if you think about what that is, the striving of the spirit toward great things, when, how, where has that actually been articulated as it relates to American military aid for Ukraine? I actually think it's a great example, both in the general and in the specific.
Johnny, Dr. Robertson kind of fleshed out the difference between maybe what's uniquely American when we think about statesmanship versus not. One of the first things I noticed when I picked up your book was the inclusion of thinkers and practitioners of the East, such as Han Fei and Catilia. Could you say a word about any differences you noticed between the theory and practice of statesmanship in the West versus the East, and maybe in particular, if there's anything you think we in the West should take from that Eastern tradition?
Yeah, so I think, first and foremost in the East, and you see this really in most traditions, but it's very pronounced in the East. which is, a great leader. You cannot be a great leader if you cannot rule yourself, right? So there's a strong sense of self-mastery, self-control. Your enemies, who you'll have many of if you're an effective statesman, will destroy you if you're shooting yourself in the foot because you cannot control your speech, your actions, your morals. And so there's a high priority that's placed on exercising mastery over yourself. You see that in Catilia. You also see that in Xenophon, the education of Cyrus, as he's leading his men on military campaigns. The second thing is in the East that's significantly more different in the Chinese context is that the leader does not reveal his policy preferences to his ministers. This would be a little bit harder in a more democratic system like our own, but their reasoning is basically, if a leader is too telling on where he wants policy to go, the ministers are simply just going to flatter him and really tailor their proposals to please his ear. Instead, he should, pose a question to his advisors and not reveal his desired answer and let them come in one after another and kind of present the direction that they think they should go in. And then he should evaluate things by himself in silence before deciding on a direction. So those are two things that stand out. The last thing I might add is I found the Eastern tradition to be very, almost proto-Machiavellian, very realist in its outlook. This might be an oversimplification, but there's an extent to which the ends of kind of saving and maintaining the state do justify the means. And so that outlook of realism stood out to me.
One of the themes that emerges in Xenophon's education of Cyrus, and it's encapsulated in a conversation between Xenophon and his father tells him, the easiest way to lead good men is by being truly great. You must actually have the virtues, cultivate the virtues within yourself that would cause great men to want to follow you. Of course, Machiavelli does, in some sense, flip that on its head and suggest that the seeming greatness is more important than the being greatness. And Johnny, you've suggested that perhaps some of these Asian texts, Eastern texts, are allowing that maybe the seeming is more important than the being. But it seems like perhaps we could characterize this crisis of statesmanship that we've all observed here in Washington, D.C., or in the West generally now, as being an overemphasis on appearances and seeming, especially enabled by modern technology. Senator Vance or Dr. Roberts, could you speak a little bit to this tension between appearing a leader versus being one indeed, and how we cultivate the virtues required for that?
Well, one observation I'd make here, just in response to that, is a good friend of mine, Tucker Carlson, who I'm sure many people in this chat know. He is fond of saying that if you want to be a leader or you want to have any position of public, public posture in the country today, you have to be extraordinarily self-controlled, and you have to be physically and mentally strong. And I think about this a lot in the context of, if you're a senator or you're running for significant political office, it's kind of amazing just how much they come at you with, right? They'll sort of attack you on any number of things. Every vulnerability the opposition will exploit. And that's probably been true throughout history. And so I think that, like, one way I think about this sort of this perception or reality of being strong, we can talk about the tension of those between those in a second, is that if you're not strong, you're not going to be an effective leader because they will come at you with everything that they have and they will ultimately be successful. And nobody's perfect, of course. Everybody has weaknesses, but I think it's important to try to cultivate as much strength in yourself as possible, because you're not going to be able to deal with the stresses, with the attacks, and with the sort of opposition, especially if it's an effective opposition. And I think today on the right we have quite an effective opposition. So I do think that you have to actually be really strong. And to get to this point about the tension between perception and reality, I mean, look, I think there are obviously, like, there's always, and this is sort of less true today probably than it was 100 years ago, and less true 100 years ago than it was 500 years ago. Like, your capacity to cultivate an image that's completely divorced from reality, I'm not saying it doesn't exist today, but it's much, much harder, right? Between social media, between digital media, and just the fact that you're constantly followed around all the time. Like, these are not like, kings of England from 600 years ago, where you can cultivate this persona that's completely divorced from reality. Like, if you're faking it, it will become pretty obvious pretty quickly in an era of social media. And I think there are sort of downsides to this, right? Sometimes people become too cultivated, or they think too much about what they're going to say. And in some ways, probably the issue that we have with leaders today is probably the opposite of what you might have had with leaders a few hundred years ago, where they're so self-aware about the fact that everything that they say is being captured. They're probably too careful and they're too cautious, and they don't spend enough time actually thinking interesting ideas or saying interesting things, because they recognize that it's going to get used against them. And just sort of on this point, I was talking once with a person who's now a federal judge, actually, and this is probably sort of 10 or 15 years ago. I was in law school, and I was just sort of asking this person, how do you kind of deal with the tension between, you want to say interesting things, you want to be a thought leader, it's necessary to sort of be successful in the legal academy, to even be the type of person who might eventually get tapped to be a federal judge, and yet you say something too controversial, it might be used against you in your confirmation hearings, if that's ultimately your ambition, as it was for this person. And the answer was like really revealing. I mean, the person basically said, look, you try to be as interesting as possible without creating a weapon for them to be used against you to destroy you. But I think that's a really pernicious thing for leaders to think of, is don't be too interesting, because then the opposition might use your interesting ideas against you. Like, we actually want people who are interesting and who are thinking about the big things. And we don't just want sort of automatons who are repeating the slogans because they know the slogans are the things they're not going to get attacked over. So I think there is a real tension here between perception and reality. I just think that tension is probably different now than it was for leaders of a couple hundred years ago.
Micah, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I was going to say, Dr. Roberts, so we're drawing on, or Johnny has drawn on, the Mirror for Princes tradition. You've been an educator in primary, secondary, and collegiate school contexts. So in your opinion, what does it mean to give an education worthy of princes to students today in what is a democratic and egalitarian society?
Oh man, you've asked me a doozy of a question, but one that's my greatest passion, because I think the sort of twofold truth here. The first is the most noble promise that the American Republic makes to its people, among all of the noble promises we make, is that every American child will receive the best education known to man. That's the promise. And that education, for most of our history, at least until the creation of the Department of Education in 1979, was an education worthy of princes. And there were literal paupers, millions, tens of millions of American paupers who got that education worthy of princes. But the second reality of that twofold reality is that we have failed miserably as a republic in doing that over the last several decades, and we're violating that promise such that, and this will sound partisan, but actually it's just a fact of life, that if you are a Democrat elected official at the federal or state level and you are supportive of parental freedom, of school choice, you're likely to be banished from the party. The point that I want to make here, gentlemen, is not even so much that point about the idiocy of that reality for the Democrats. It's that what that party, what members of that political movement are saying is that they want to violate that noble promise of providing an education for princes. And so let me just sum up with what is admittedly my hobby horse, having started a K through 12 classical school and run a classical college. And at Heritage, beyond the things y'all know us well for, we're very involved in the classical education movement. The objective for those of us who fashion ourselves education reformers is not just universal school choice. Getting universal school choice, which we will get in this country in our lifetimes, is going to give us the means to the end. The end is what you said. It is providing the education worthy of princes for all American children. And that means that conservatives, Heritage has had to make this shift as well, have to be paying as much attention to the content of education as we do the delivery mechanism, so-called school choice, education savings accounts. And so as we prepare for a friendlier presidential administration and hopefully philosophically aligned majorities in the House and the Senate at the federal level, we need to be prepared not just to fight for school choice. We've got to be prepared to extend the fighting that we've been doing for not just classical education, great books education, which of course Johnny had to have in order to write the book that he wrote, but to be able to do that for the purpose of providing this worthy education to each American child and ultimately for the continuation of the American Republic. So I'm grateful for the question. And I have to say, unfortunately, I really do have to go get on this airplane. So I'll have to drop off, but I am really grateful to be with all of you and to have had the opportunity to join you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Roberts, thank you very much for taking the time. It was great to have you with us. And we'll continue the conversation here. Senator Vance, one of the things you said that stood out to me was you need to be strong, right? And talking about the differentiation between perception and what you actually are, perception and being. And Johnny, one of the things you did in your book was you laid out these unifying themes and principles of these works into 12 laws of leadership, right? Universal principles applicable to all circumstances. And one of these 12 laws you lay out is power. And questions of power are obviously deeply political. Who has power? How much do they have? What is the power for? So on and so forth. And these are questions being fiercely debated on the American right today. Right? The so-called old right might be criticized as being afraid to wield power. The new right is being too eager to use power. So maybe Senator Vance, we could start with you and then go to Johnny. How do you think about power and how it ought to be limited, to what ends it ought to be used, these sorts of questions?
Yeah, it's always tough to be too abstract about this stuff, right? Because there are sort of very specific instances where the abstractions kind of fall apart, or at least don't totally make the same amount of sense. I mean, I guess the way that I think about this broadly is, we live in a country where power is handed out, at least theoretically, democratically, hopefully democratically, not always. But you have, I think, a sort of progressive movement that is enthusiastic about the prospect of using power, and you have a conservative movement that very often sort of saw its purpose as scaling back progressive exercises of power rather than pursuing its own ends. And that, I think, was a really, really significant problem. And if there's a sort of distinction between the new right and the old right, it probably, again, abstractions are always really challenging, but it's probably that the old right was terrified of using power for conservative ends, and the new right is not. And to try to concretize that a little bit, just take sort of one particular hobby horse of mine, which is the use of trade policy to protect industries that are necessary for America's national defense and also good for America's workers. I think the old right of 30 or 40 years ago would have said that, look, if China wants to subsidize the steel industry or the computer chip industry, or give whatever industry you have in mind, in order to ensure that it dominates the production of that particular industry, then great, right? You can't use power to push back against that, because you'll introduce all these inefficiencies in the marketplace. And if China wants to subsidize the production of cheap steel, then that will benefit American consumers. And yeah, it's sad that people lose their job in the heartland, but that's not really the main focus. If we want to fix that problem, let's maybe hand out some additional welfare checks. And I think where the new right would sort of take a pretty radically different approach is to say, well, we actually have the power to protect some native industries. We have the power to protect our workers. And should we be using them? Like, isn't it better for a guy to get a paycheck at a livable wage than a welfare check? Isn't that better for the person's dignity? Doesn't it make that person a better provider, a better husband, a better father? Better mother, better participant in society? I think the answer that I would say is, obviously yes. And so we have to be willing to use public policy to accomplish things that we care about, like a livable wage, like parents who are able to play a good role in the lives of their children, able to sort of support a family on a decent income. Like these are things that conservatives care about, and so you can't run away from the exercise of power to accomplish them. And that to me is sort of how I most think about that. And then there are sort of all these sort of classical questions How much power do you want the federal government to have versus the state government? How do you want to limit it in various ways? I think in a lot of those ways, sort of conservatives of both the old and the new stripes are largely aligned, or at least thinking along the same ways. But I think on some of these questions about exercising power to accomplish certain goals the conservatives care about, I think this has been a pretty radical break between the old generation and the new generation of conservatives.
Johnny, what do you think? I mean, was there anything that stood out to you as you were reading these texts about how these authors, these practitioners treated the use of power, either in the abstract or the particular?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I define power as the energy that makes prudent action possible, right? The capacity to marshal political, economic, and relationship capital in pursuit of specific goals, right? So, if you're looking back at the ancient world, really the first of those goals was establishing order, right? Order was seen in the ancient world as a precondition for peace and then for justice. And this was really the first task of any great statesman. Acknowledging that there's a thin line between civilization and anarchy. And when you have anarchy, it's really the poor, right, and the middle classes that suffer. It's only the rich, the elites that can isolate themselves from that anarchy. So I think that art, of ensuring order, so that justice and peace can flourish. That is sort of the first exercise of power that any great leader in the ancient world is certainly pursuing. I mean, there's a number of other things. I mean, great leaders are often builders of beautiful things. This is why historically, great leaders have built infrastructure. They've built churches. They've built monuments. They built other public spaces really devoted to raising the minds and elevating the hearts of their people. And all these things, the capacity to build great things, right? That requires power to marshal the resources to get that done. And then finally, I think to JD's point about trade policy, really all that has to do with ensuring that we in America have the greatest middle class on the face of the earth, and we once had that at a period in time in the mid 20th century, and that was the result of certain deliberate policies that were pursued quite energetically by our government. And then we switched to a different course, and that middle class has been hollowed out. So I do think that a lot of this shift towards more comfortable use of power, in one sense, it's an important shift, but in another sense, you're always, government is always exercising power, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. And so I think there's just an awakening saying, hey, there's a few very fundamental things that are essential for our society to be a free and a prosperous one. And having a sense of order, right, particularly around the southern border, particularly around crime, having a sense of building the necessary things so that our infrastructure can be up to par, and then also ensuring the common good through the right trade and economic policies. I think these are the types of things that we're talking about when we're talking about exercising power today.
Johnny, who in composing this book was left on the cutting room floor? It's a bit of a jump from Thomas More and Utopia to George Washington's farewell address. And by the time we're getting into the modern figures, you might make an argument that it's a stretch to call this participation in the Mirror of Princes genre. These are texts about statesmanship, but these are perhaps not complete examples of the genre. So I would note, as an Anglican, as a Protestant, that there's this gap here. Your Reformation figures and early modern figures are limited. I'm curious if there's anybody that you left off. Did Shakespeare, did you consider including Shakespeare as a kind of theorist of statesmanship, or did you stick to just political figures? And who else would you have included, or if you'd had more time? And I guess for Senator Vance, are there any historical figures that you look to in particular as examples of statesmanship?
Yeah, real quick. So Victor Davis Hanson suggested that I include one of Plutarch's lives in here. And I really wanted to do that, but there was just not enough room to fit it all in. So maybe in a second volume. I also did not include. So Shakespeare could have been good. Someone recommended. I can't remember which play in particular they thought would have fallen into the Mirrors for Princes category, but a selection from Shakespeare could have been fun. I also left Abraham Lincoln out of this, mostly because I really wanted to focus on texts that most people weren't getting from the current readers on statesmanship or politics. I really wanted to kind of repopularize a forgotten tradition, and so that's why I avoided those three. But perhaps in a future volume, I'll pick them back up.
Yeah, so I'd recommend Johnny's book because he chronicles and sort of gives some interesting summaries of a lot of interesting statesmen throughout time. One person who I think the American right just really radically underrates, and for a long time, when I was sort of growing up in the conservative movement and like the late '90s and early 2000s, and sort of reading about various conservative figures, there was this sort of person who was perceived by the American right as this squishy moderate, and that was Dwight Eisenhower. And if you sort of think of some of the things that he did on American industrial development, on infrastructure, on American greatness, to Johnny's point about great statesmen being builders of things. I mean, Ike was fundamentally a great builder of things, and even like certain things where he doesn't get enough credit for. I mean, I think his farewell address and some of the observations he made about the military industrial complex are like frankly one of the more interesting sets of insights about the relationship between American industry and foreign policy that like I've ever read. And we just don't talk about them nearly enough. And he was a very mild-mannered guy, obviously, sort of one of our most mild-mannered presidents. But there are things like border enforcement that he was extraordinarily serious about. And I think it shows that sometimes even people who are pretty mild mannered can take some pretty aggressive and pretty extraordinary action when it's necessary in the preservation of the country. So I think Eisenhower is just a fascinating figure. Obviously, an incredible military leader, a person I think understood the logistics of modern war probably better than anybody of the 20th century, and also was just a very, very good and effective president. I think predicted a lot of the problems that we would have over the next, sort of 75 years after he left office.
A word Dr. Roberts used while he was with us was a promise. The American right, it's not enough to only offer freedom from, you need to offer them some substantive vision of the good. And Senator Vance, when you announced your run for Senate, you cited your children as an inspiration for running. And you said, I want them to live in the same great country I did. I have a 7-month-old daughter and a son on the way, and it's changed my politics, especially the way I think about certain key political issues very dramatically. So I'd be curious to hear from you. What stands in the way of our children in the nation we grew up in? This could be institutions, ways of thinking, however you want to address it. And then similarly, what's your kind of elevator pitch for the America we want to return to or rebuild?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, those are very, very big issues, and I won't possibly do them justice. But one elevator pitch is I want to return to an American greatness of making incredible things, of doing great deeds, of going far away places, and of building the kind of nation where that's possible. And I sort of think about like the space program, how these guys were able to go to the moon with pocket calculators, and there was this interesting way where that project is sort of ties this all together, right? You had, of course, the engineers who thought this stuff up. You had the incredible genius and the school system that produced the education system that produced that genius that allowed us to make these rockets. But you also had factory workers building an incredibly set of complicated things that allowed us to go to the moon. You had the janitors at NASA who were keeping the place clean. Like this was a true national project. And I think that if there's sort of a pitch for American conservatism in the next generation, it's that we need to get back to this kind of country that builds great things, that does great things, and where we're sort of all doing this together. And that's really hard to do when you're, obsessed with diversity at the exclusion of merit. That's really hard to do when your education system is doing a little bit too much indoctrination and not enough actually teaching children important skills that they need to learn. It's really hard to sort of connect past, present, and future when you have a leadership that seems to be at war with American history and some of its greatest figures, instead of teaching American children to draw inspiration from those great figures. So I think there's like a whole political program that comes from that. But I'm a real believer in the idea of national greatness, of building great things and doing great things, And I'd say that's different, by the way, from the sort of the theory of American exceptionalism, where we're just the best because we're the best, but there's not actually a lot of consideration into what made us the best. A friend of mine sort of famously once said, "I prefer greatness to American exceptionalism," and I think that's certainly where I'm at. Um, if there's sort of a lot else I could say beyond that. But maybe I'll just maybe I'll just pause there, and actually, if any of you want to riff off that or respond to it, happy to go further.
Yeah, if I could just jump in. I mean, I feel like that kind of the American exceptionalism, which is like I think that really is rooted from the kind of from the starting point that America is purely an idea, and since it's the distillation, in this telling of the perfect idea, we're just the best because we are the best. Where I think kind of what I think you're getting at, JD, and certainly what I espouse is, I want to be great because we're actually we are the best people, right, on earth in terms of moral excellence, also in terms of just the creative energy that we're bringing to problem solving, building great things, building the greatest middle class, that can be the envy of the world. I think that greatness, needs to be backed up by more than just ideas, right, as much as we value ideas, but by the actual substance of the material, the moral flourishing that our country actually has.
Yeah, two things that come to mind in response to that, and then Mike, I know you have a question. Uh, One is this just returns to this theme of perception versus being, right? The kind of vision of American exceptionalism is one of perception. American greatness is one of being. You could ask yourselves, what did you build? Right? How did you concretely make this nation better for your children, for your posterity? Um, uh, I would recommend to everyone actually this new piece Julius Krein has out in American Affairs, and he makes this argument where he says we talk a lot about this great power competition with China, but these discussions take place almost exclusively on the dimension of national security. But we also just need to become the kind of people, Johnny, to your point, of winning such a competition. So I'll get off the soapbox there. Micah, over to you.
Well, I think I want to undermine my own earlier question to Dr. Roberts and suggest, is there some sort of tension, Johnny, between the many studying the works of the few or texts that are addressed to the few as we aspire to this American dynamism and to fulfill this vision for American greatness? Should we perhaps be just focused on texts like Roosevelt's in this one, Theodore Roosevelt's, or Washington's farewell address, where it's a mirror for citizenship. It's a mirror for citizens, and it's framed in the sort of democratic republicanism of our regime. What is the benefit? What virtues are inculcated for us as citizens when we study these texts that are unapologetically aristocratic, that are men who, are calls for princes to reflect God in ways that make, I think, our contemporary society uncomfortable and are obviously non-egalitarian in certain ways. So how do we navigate that, and what is it that we learn in our context to meet the challenges that tomorrow promises us, and to ensure that America can be great?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think my vantage point, right, is I put this book together as a book for, by and for leaders, right? It's this is not a book for citizenship, kind of writ large. I think it's one of those things that, I think populism is a healthy thing. All right, to the extent that it is pushing back against the failures of our contemporary elite class, in which there are many of them. But at the end of the day, at the most fundamental level, every society, regardless of the type of government that you're in, will always have some form of an elite class. And so, this book really had in mind the education and the formation of those who would be taking their place at the highest levels of American society, whether that's in business, politics, or culture. But that's not to say we ought to ignore the everyday citizen, right? I mean, I'm an everyday citizen, right? I'm not a member of Congress, and so I think there is something to be learned for everyday citizens, just in terms of helping them to become more moral human beings and more committed to their family, to their local communities. In America, right, there's a sense of self-government, right, that we all have participating in this experiment in liberty. But at the end of the day, I do think we have to focus on the quality of our leadership, because we've seen the damage done when institutions like Harvard, these purportedly elite institutions that are really the gatekeepers in our society, have become totally captured by ideology, and they keep churning these people out who are really, driving America into the ground. So I think we have to really rethink the elite formation and education in this country, and that will be a faster route than just simply coming up with a program to share with the masses.
To that point, Senator Vance, how does the right take back elite education or again participate, especially in the humanities? I think this is a question in part suggested by a good friend, Seth Newkirk, listening in, and he asks, so much of the right, its answer to the corruption of our elite forming institutions, especially the Ivy Leagues, has been a retreat to the technical, a retreat to STEM and business. Even sometimes, a retreat to Silicon Valley. Of course, it's very interesting that I think 0 to 1 is probably the best example of a mirror for princes written in the last 2 decades. So, but all that to say, so there are things to learn there, of course, and there's a source of power there that needs to be wielded. But how do we take back the traditional source of cultivating these virtues of statesmanship, which is the humanities and elite liberal arts education?
Well, I think one part of the solution is we have to go back to this point that we made about actually obtaining through electoral victory and then wielding power. The reason that the left, I think, has been so dominant among our elite institutions is in part because they have very effectively wielded the levers of power, of course, to create this massive bureaucracy, this administrative bureaucracy. Some of it's DEI, but others, I mean, it's the entire democracy, or sorry, the entire bureaucracy of our universities, which has effectively become controlled and dominated by sort of the left of center. If you sort of just look at where American universities were even 50 years ago, historians, political scientists, sociologists, yeah, a lot of them were left of center and sort of liberal bias, but now it's like North Korea, right? You sort of look at the donation and voting habits of these particular departments, and they're 95 to 5, and if you're sort of in a place where 70 to 30 liberal bias, then you're kind of living in a liberal biased place. If you're living in a place that's 95 to 5 biased in any direction, you're living in a fundamentally totalitarian society. There's sort of no way in which any natural organic system leads to a 95-5 outcome. Just people naturally sort of gravitate and develop differences that are a lot healthier, and where there's sort of there are different groupings that are a lot more significant institutionally. And the reason we haven't done that is because of funding, of resources. There are a whole spate, of course, of legal regimes, but also a lot of resources that have gone into developing left-wing curricula, enforcing left-wing bias, and of course, this has sort of filtered its way down to, academic departments themselves. I do think we sort of have to think about like the goal here is fundamentally not just to defund the left-wing part of the bureaucracy, but in some ways to refund part of the bureaucracy that could be a little bit more open to conservative ideas. We're very good, or at least we like to think that we're pretty good at sort of ratcheting back the achievements of the left, but that's not enough, right? If a particular department has a 95-5 bias, and you defund it a little bit when conservatives are in power, and then the left refunds it when they're in power, then you're just slowing the way in which this gets ratcheted further and further to the right. I think you have to actually develop alternative institutions, do alternative credentialing regimes. We've sort of worked on legislation that will, roll out here eventually, that would actually make it much harder to discriminate against people who aren't degree holders, because I think there is a lot of interesting humanities formation that's existing outside of the traditional 4-year higher education pathways. So we should be promoting those pathways and not just sort of, pretending they don't exist or pretending they only exist to raise up particular professions. That's important, of course. You want people to have access to good skills and good training outside of the 4-year degree pathway, but you also want people who are interested in the humanities to actually have some capacity to study those things and to learn in those environments without an extraordinary left-wing bias. And the last thing that I'd say here is, just to sort of observation to tie this together is if you look at sort of where conservatives are most strong within the academy, it's sort of what I think, Micah, you made this point. We're not bad in the humanities, we're not bad in the sciences, we're not bad in STEM, we're not bad in math heavy things, but we're really, really bad in the humanities. And if I could sort of, do one thing to change the American university, it's that I'd trade a lot of conservative economists for a lot more conservative historians. I think the lack of conservative presence in history departments is really, really dangerous and has meant, frankly, that conservatives are at a massive disadvantage in winning the war on ideas and the war for ideas.
I know we have only a few minutes left here, but a theme that seems to me kind of lurking in the background is the plight of young men in America. Young men today seem to be addicted to porn, to marijuana. They're unable to find and hold jobs. They're being discriminated against in the workplace, in the college admissions process. Even the military, long a bastion of the masculine virtues, is being hollowed out. Those virtues themselves are being denigrated. Senator Vance, Johnny, I'm curious if you all have thoughts on this, if you share those concerns, and if so, what you think stand as plausible solutions to this.
Yeah, so I'm happy to jump in here, and then I'm going to have to fall off the conversation. I appreciate you guys for hosting it. Again, I encourage everybody to go and buy Johnny's book because I think it's important and it's well done. But I certainly see this through the prism of being the father to two sons. A 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, and then we have a 2-year-old baby girl too. And just one like really weird thing that I've picked up on is, when I was a kid, we were really into. I mean, let's be honest, we were into violent games, right? We were, cops and robbers. We were the bad guys, or we were the good guys, or we sort of do Star Wars games. We do any number of games which were fundamentally rooted around one group of boys fighting another group of boys. And I think that was like, in hindsight, just a very, very important part of male social development. And I've noticed even with my 6 and 4-year olds how extremely uncomfortable a lot of parents are on a playground with anything that sort of even like trends in the direction of violent play. And sort of like one example from a couple of years ago, I was with my now 6-year-old on a playground, and he and a group of other kids decided that they were going to fight the imaginary dragon on the playground. And sort of one of the parents kind of stepped in and said, "Well, maybe we should see if the dragon is hungry. Maybe the dragon wants to be our friend." And it was like this just absurd moment where it's like they were being kids, right? Like we're not raising like future sociopaths because our kids want to fight the imaginary dragon. Like this is a necessary part of child development. And the fact that we're so uncomfortable, I think, with basic male impulses is one of the reasons why boys are falling further and further behind at school. It's one of the reasons why I think just men are struggling with greater substance abuse, greater mental health problems than they ever have before. And I don't fully know the solution to the problem. I mean, obviously, porn addiction is part of this, and there are all these sort of, individual things that we could point to. The overprescription of Ritalin, I think, among 5 and 6-year olds, because we sort of pathologized basic young boy restlessness, where it's like, okay, yeah, maybe they need Ritalin, or maybe actually what they need is just a little bit more time outdoors to play, and for adults to not try to suppress every single impulse that they have within them. And I basically think that one of the challenges for conservatives, one of the tasks for conservatives in the next generation, is going to be to really make the argument that yes, men and women are actually different, and yes, boys and girls are different, and we actually need to recognize that our young boys are not doing especially well. But to do that, you really have to, I think, acknowledge that there are differences between boys and girls. And right now, the elites of our society are very uncomfortable with that. But I think this is a really good issue because I think most normal people, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, recognize that like, yeah, boys and girls on average are much different from one another, and you need to have spaces and you need to have institutions that recognize that and cultivate the distinctive traits in both boys and girls. And if you don't do that, you're going to wake up in the America of 2024 where boys are just doing much, much worse than they have historically. And yeah, I worry about it a lot. I'm not sure what the problem is, but I think it starts with just, or I'm not sure what the solution is, I should say, but I think a big part of it starts with telling the truth. And there are a lot of parents out there, I think, who are desperate for leaders that just acknowledge that one, boys and girls are different, and two, boys are not doing so well on sort of a large social scale.
Yes, Senator, thank you so much for that answer and for taking the time today. I know you have to run, but it was really wonderful to have you with us. Johnny, I don't know if you want to chime in on the question of the masculine virtues in American politics, or any concluding thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I would, add to that is perhaps I think perhaps the study of biographies could be of help. I mean, this is one thing that you see, you see it in Machiavelli's The Prince, but you see it in a lot of these other kind of great, these great political leaders, is that they spend a lot of time really immersing themselves in the world of other great leaders. And in this particular question, other great men who have come before them, because I do think, especially when you're trapped in a moment culturally, and it's hard to really see, well, how do we get, positive influences in front of our young men, especially when we're in a context where the context that we're in, the milieu that we're surrounded in, is part of the problem. I think one of the solution is really putting before their mind, whether it's reading biographies, listening to them, watching documentaries, really reshaping their imagination about what great men have achieved in previous eras and what virtues they exhibited. That's one way. That's one start that we can make to hopefully ameliorate the crisis today.
Yeah, this seems to me to be one of the cruelest aspects of the left's war. Tearing down these statues of great men, uh, even taking the classics out of the classroom, right? To teach a young man about Lycurgus, to teach a young man about Alcibiades, about these great men who came before them, and that they stand on the shoulders of these giants, I think is very meaningful. Micah, do you have any concluding questions or comments?
Yeah, I would have one more question for Johnny, which is, I think maybe the last really healthy intermediary institution which characterized American life, as Alexis de Tocqueville observed in the 19th century, is our churches. And Tocqueville thought that what characterized these institutions was the way in which we practiced our republicanism in miniature, and prepared us in some sense for our increasingly democratic national politics. So is there a way in which should your book be perhaps a call to action for America's pastors? And is this is the home front for the battle for statesmanship in America perhaps America's churches? And what would you say to that, Johnny?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Well, in some sense, the answer is absolutely yes. As I mentioned before, in terms of, there's really two pieces of advice from the Mirrors for Prince's tradition. The one is the political advice. The second is the moral advice. And really, the first of the moral advice is that self-mastery, self-control, ruling yourself. And, really that is most fundamentally passed on through religion. And yeah, the reason for that is pretty obvious. But a good old fashioned kind of religious faith teaches you, the virtues of, it starts really with fasting. This is kind of the heart of, certainly the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox expression of the faith, but it goes really back all the way to the Christians in the very first centuries, fasting 2 days a week. It was really built on the whole premise that you have to, learn if you can control what you can put in your mouth, right? Then you might be able to control your other actions, your other words, your other deeds. And so I think really that first step in that moral formation of establishing self-control and self-mastery, that's something that is really the paramount task of the church. And then secondly, the mentorship that is required to grow in the life of virtue with either a spiritual director or the mentors or elders that you have at your particular parish, and the way that can then impact the families that attend the church and their culture at home. I mean, that's really the, sort of the bottom up foundation for establishing and inculcating virtue in any healthy society.
Well, I promised we'd get everyone out of here in an hour, so I'm afraid we'll have to draw things to a close there. Johnny, thank you so much for taking the time today, but even more importantly, thank you for taking the time to put together Gateway to Statesmanship. I'm sure that was no small task, but you really have given all of us interested in preserving the American way of life, preserving the West, a resource that will be invaluable going forward. It's rare that I would actually say to an author and mean it that I'll buy their book and give it to people, but I have done that and will continue to do that with Gateway to Statesmanship. So thank you very much for all the great work you're doing on this front.
Yeah, well, thank you, Nino and Micah. You're incredibly generous, and I'm, very honored that you're such an enthusiastic promoter, not of my book, but of the contents and the great authors that are in this collection. That means a lot.
All right. Well, and unless Micah has any closing thoughts, he'll cut me off and offer those. But otherwise, thanks to everyone that tuned in and listened to this either live or on the recorded version. Again, like I mentioned, this will be a series Micah and I will be conducting. You can listen to the first of those conversations with the great Will Tebow from the Claremont American Military Project. You can find that on my timeline or on Micah's and coming soon in podcast form soon. But thank you all very much.